Hey, welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy tonight's stories. Here we venture into the dark web, peeling back layers of mystery and terror to reveal tales that were never meant to be told. Leave a like and subscribe for more dark web scary stories. I took a babysitting job for a family I found on the dark web. The child doesn't blink, and their shadow moves before they do. Alright, so I know how this sounds. You're already thinking, why would anyone find a babysitting job on the dark web? Trust me, I didn't plan on it. In fact, I didn't even realize that's where I was. It started as just one of those nights where I was scrolling aimlessly through random sites, bored out of my mind, looking for something interesting, maybe a weird story or a niche job board because I was between gigs. Then I stumbled across this forum. It didn't look like anything special, just a black background, plain text, some threads about off-market opportunities and discrete transactions. Honestly, I thought it was one of those shady freelance sites where people hire you for things like delivering packages they don't want to touch or cleaning up messes they don't want to explain. Not great, but not the kind of dark web stuff you hear about on horror podcasts either. And then I saw the post, urgent babysitter needed, overnight pay $1,200, discretion required. It was the $1,200 that caught my attention. I mean, come on, that's insane money for one night. I was broke, my landlord was breathing down my neck, and I figured, what's the worst that could happen? The kid throws a tantrum. So I clicked. The post didn't give much info, just that the job was for one night in a private house about 30 minutes outside of town. They needed someone comfortable with non-traditional family dynamics, whatever that meant, and who could follow instructions without question. Sketchy, sure, but a $1,200 sketchy? I was willing to take the risk. I sent a reply, keeping it professional, but not too desperate. Within minutes, I got a response. It was just an address, a time, 8 p.m., and a final line. Do not arrive early. Do not ask questions. If that didn't set off alarm bells, I don't know what should have. But at the time, I chalked it up to rich, eccentric parents who didn't want some nosy sitter prying into their weird art collections or whatever. So, I said yes. The night of, I pulled up to the address right at 8 p.m. The house was massive, one of those modern, boxy mansions that looked more like an art exhibit than a home. There were no cars in the driveway, no lights on inside, just the faint glow of a porch light that flickered like it was on its last leg. I knocked, and the door opened almost immediately, like someone had been waiting. But no one was there. Just an empty hallway leading into the dark. "Hello," I called out, stepping inside. My voice echoed down the corridor. It smelled faintly of bleach, like the place had been scrubbed top to bottom. A woman's voice answered, sharp and distant. "Take your shoes off and come to the living room." I hesitated. The voice didn't sound like it came from any specific direction. It was just there. But I did what she said, leaving my sneakers by the door and walking deeper into the house. The living room was huge, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a pitch-black yard. A single lamp lit the space, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The woman stood near the couch, her back to me. She was tall and thin, her hair tied up in a bun so tight it looked like it might hurt. She didn't turn around when I entered, just said, "The child is upstairs. Bedtime is 9 p.m. Do not enter any room but theirs. Do not open the windows. Do not use your phone while you're here." Her voice was flat, like she was reading off a script. Before I could say anything, she turned, handed me an envelope, which I assumed was the payment, and walked out. Not to another room, out the front door. I was alone. Well, not completely alone. There was still the kid upstairs. I made my way up, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The second floor was darker than the first, the kind of dark that makes you feel like you're being watched. The hallway was lined with doors, each identical, but only one was open. I stepped inside. The kids sat cross-legged in the middle of the room, facing the wall. They didn't turn around when I came in, didn't even flinch. Just sat there, staring at nothing. "Hey, buddy," I said, trying to sound cheerful despite the lump forming in my throat. "I'm your babysitter for tonight. What's your name?" No response. I moved closer, keeping my voice light. "All right, no problem. I'll just hang out here until bedtime, okay?" Still nothing. That's when I noticed the shadow. It stretched across the room, cast by the faint light from the hallway. But something about it was wrong. It moved, slowly, deliberately, before the kid did, like it was deciding where they'd go next. My stomach dropped. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The kid finally turned to look at me and I froze. Their face was blank, not emotionless, blank. Wide, unblinking eyes, a faint smile that didn't reach anywhere near their eyes, and they didn't stop staring. "Do you need anything?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their head once, slow and deliberate, then turned back to the wall. I stayed in the doorway, too freaked out to move. I kept glancing at the shadow, convinced it was going to move again, but it didn't. At least, not that I could see. At 9 p.m., I told the kid it was bedtime. They stood without a word, walked to the bed, and laid down, facing the wall. They didn't ask for a story or water or anything, just laid there. I pulled the blanket over them, then stepped back toward the door, my eyes flicking between the kid and their shadow. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The shadow on the wall wasn't the kid's. It was taller, thinner, its arms too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And as I stood there, frozen, I swear it turned to look at me. The moment I saw the shadow turn, I backed out of the room, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't even bother closing the door. My brain was screaming at me to leave, to run, but there was this weird pull, like I couldn't just abandon the kid, even if they were wrong. I made my way downstairs, trying to shake off the eerie feeling clinging to me like a second skin. The living room felt colder now, the air heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. I checked the front door just to reassure myself that I could leave if I needed to, but it wouldn't budge. The lock turned just fine, but the door wouldn't open, no matter how hard I pulled. I told myself it was probably just an old house thing. Doors swell or stick sometimes, right? But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I could feel it. Something didn't want me to leave. To calm myself down, I tried to distract myself. I checked the envelope the woman had handed me earlier. Inside was a stack of crisp $100 bills, way more than I'd expected. There was also a note, written in neat, looping handwriting. Follow the rules. Do not check on the child after 9:30 p.m. Keep the lights on at all times. My stomach flipped. I hadn't turned on any lights upstairs before I left the kids' room. The hallway had been dark, the kids' room lit only by the faint glow from the hall. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should go back up and turn on the lights, but the idea of stepping back into that hallway sent a chill through me. I decided to sit on the couch instead, keeping the note clutched in my hand like it was a lifeline. It wasn't long before I started hearing noises. At first, it was subtle. A faint creaking from upstairs like someone shifting their weight on an old floorboard. Then it grew louder. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the second floor. My gut told me to stay put, but my curiosity got the better of me. Gripping my phone like a weapon, I crept toward the base of the stairs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is everything okay up there?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the silence stretched on. Just as I started to relax, there was a loud crash from above, like something heavy had been thrown across the room. My heart shot into my throat. Against every ounce of common sense, I climbed the stairs. The hallway was darker than before, the shadows longer, stretching in impossible angles. The door to the kids' room was still open, but the light inside flickered like a candle about to go out. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. The kid was still in bed, lying in the exact same position as before, but now the blanket was pulled over their head. The shadow on the wall, however, wasn't lying down. It stood in the corner of the room, taller and more defined than before, its long arms hanging at unnatural angles. And it was moving. Not much, just a subtle twitch here and there, like it was stretching or testing its boundaries. I wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadow. Then, without warning, the kid's voice broke the silence. They don't like it when you watch them. The blanket still covered their face, and their voice was flat, emotionless, like they were reading a line from a script. Before I could respond, the shadow turned. It didn't have a face, just a void where its head should have been. But I felt its attention shift to me. The light flickered again, and the room plunged into darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted out of the room. The hallway was even darker now, the shadows practically alive, shifting and writhing like something was crawling through them. I fumbled for the nearest light switch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely flip it on. The hallway lit up, and everything went still. The shadows froze, retreating to their corners like they'd been caught doing something they weren't supposed to. I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. That's when I heard it. The sound of something wet dragging across the floor. It was coming from downstairs. I crept down the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last. The dragging sound grew louder, more deliberate, and as I reached the bottom, I saw it. A long, dark streak ran across the living room floor, leading from the front door to the far wall. It looked like something, or someone, had been pulled across the room, leaving behind a trail of water. But the floor wasn't wet. It was dry, like the water was just an illusion, a trick of the light. The trail ended at the wall. I stared at it, my heart pounding, when the wall itself seemed to ripple like the surface of a pond after a stone is thrown in. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that cuts straight to your bones, and I could feel something watching me. Then I heard the kid's voice again, soft and distant like they were standing right behind me. They're awake now. My blood ran cold. I spun around, expecting to see the kid standing there, but the living room was empty. Completely still except for the faint ripple in the wall where the wet trail ended. I wanted to run, to grab my keys and get the hell out of there, but the thought of leaving that kid alone with whatever this was felt wrong. My legs felt like they were filled with lead, but I forced myself to move closer to the wall. The ripple had stopped now, but the air around it felt heavy, like standing too close to a thunderstorm. As I leaned in, trying to get a better look, I heard the kid's voice again. This time it came from upstairs. "They like to hide." The words sent a chill down my spine, and when I turned back toward the staircase, the shadows seemed darker than before, twisting and curling in unnatural patterns. The kid's room light flickered again, just barely visible from where I stood. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Then the ripple in the wall moved. It wasn't subtle this time. It bulged outward, like something was pressing against it from the other side. I staggered back, watching in horror as the shape of a hand, long, bony fingers and all, pushed against the surface, straining to break through. The wall itself groaned, the sound deep and guttural like it was in pain. I don't remember making the decision to move, but suddenly I was halfway up the stairs, taking 2 steps at a time. The kids' room was the only thing on my mind. I needed to see if they were okay. When I reached the top, the door to their room was closed. I was sure I'd left it open before. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold, freezing cold, like it had been sitting in a block of ice. I pushed the door open. The kid was sitting on the bed, their blanket pulled tight around their shoulders. Their eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room, where the shadow had been before. Now the corner was empty, but the way the kid was staring, it was like they could still see something I couldn't. "They don't like it when you run," they said softly. "Who?" I managed to choke out. "Who doesn't like it?" The kid turned to me, and for the first time since I'd arrived, they blinked. Slowly, deliberately, like they were trying to remember how. "The ones who live here," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "They don't want you here." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart pounded as I stepped further into the room, keeping my eyes on the kid. "What do you mean? Who lives here?" But before they could answer, the lights went out. The darkness was instant and absolute, swallowing the room in an oppressive void. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. All I could hear was my own breathing, shallow and panicked, and the faint rustling of the blanket as the kid moved. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard it. A low, wet sound like something heavy dragging itself across the floor. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any kind of light. The screen's glow was weak, but it was enough to illuminate the space around me. The kid was still on the bed, their eyes now wide and unblinking, staring over my shoulder. "They're behind you," they whispered. I froze, my entire body locked up, every instinct screaming at me not to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly I turned, raising the phone's light toward the sound. The figure was there. It was crouched on the floor, its limbs impossibly long, its body twisted and wrong. Its face, or what should have been its face, was just a smooth expanse of skin, featureless except for a faint impression where eyes and a mouth should be. It moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching as if it was trying to learn how to use its body. My hand tightened around the phone, and the light flickered. The thing's head snapped toward me, and even without eyes, I could feel its gaze pierce through me. I stumbled back, grabbing the kid's arm and pulling them off the bed. "We're leaving," I said, my voice trembling. "We're getting out of here." But the kid didn't move. They dug their heels into the floor, their expression eerily calm. "You can't leave," they said. "Not now." "What do you mean?" I snapped, my fear turning into frustration. "We have to—" "They won't let you," the kid interrupted. "You're part of the house now." The words didn't make sense, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what they meant. I dragged the kid toward the door, but before we could reach it, the shadows in the hallway shifted. They surged toward us like living things, swallowing the light from my phone. The figure moved again, faster this time. Its body stretched and contorted as it crawled toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural. The kid didn't scream, they didn't even flinch. They just stood there, watching as the darkness closed in around us. "Don't fight," they whispered. "It's worse if you fight." But I wasn't about to just give up. I yanked the kid's arm, pulling them through the door and into the hallway. The shadows clawed at my legs, cold and biting, but I forced myself to keep moving. The stairs seemed impossibly far away, the house stretching and twisting around us like it was alive. The last thing I heard before we reached the stairs was the sound of the wall behind us splitting open, and that low, guttural groan that sent shivers down my spine. The stairs seemed longer than they had before, like they stretched down forever. Each step groaned under our weight, the wood shifting and creaking like the house was alive and angry. Behind us, the guttural sound of the wall splitting open grew louder, and I didn't dare look back. The kid was eerily calm, their small hand in mine feeling ice cold. "You're wasting your energy," they said softly, their voice almost drowned out by the noises around us. "The house doesn't let people leave." "Well, I'm not staying," I snapped, my voice breaking. "You're coming with me, and we're getting out of here." But even as I said it, the shadows in the stairwell grew thicker, pressing in like a living, breathing thing. They wrapped around the banister, spilling over onto the walls, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Every instinct screamed at me to move faster, but the air was so heavy it felt like wading through water. We hit the first floor, but the living room looked completely different. The walls seemed closer together, their surfaces shifting and rippling like they weren't solid anymore. The long, wet streak that had led to the wall earlier was gone, replaced by dark, jagged cracks that crawled across the floor. The kid tugged at my hand, pulling me toward the front door. "You have to be quick," they said, their voice oddly steady. "Sometimes it lets people go if they move fast." That tiny glimmer of hope made me sprint. I reached the front door and grabbed the handle, twisting it as hard as I could. The lock turned, but the door wouldn't budge, just like before. I yanked harder, throwing my shoulder against it, but it was like trying to push through solid stone. "It's no use," the kid said. "It wants you to go back." "Back where?" I demanded, slamming my fist against the door. Before the kid could answer, the house shifted again. The air grew colder, and the shadows on the walls began to move, peeling away from their surfaces like they were alive. They slithered across the ceiling and floor, pooling together in the center of the living room, forming something that made my stomach twist in knots. It was the figure. This time it was taller, its limbs longer and more jagged, as though it had been feeding off the house itself. Its head cocked to the side, its featureless face tilting toward me as if it could see me even without eyes. It took one slow, deliberate step forward, its foot sinking into the floor like it was melting into the house. The kid let go of my hand and stepped forward, their voice barely above a whisper. "They don't want you to leave because they're not done with you." I grabbed the kid's arm, pulling them back. "What are you talking about? We're leaving now." The figure twitched, its head jerking unnaturally as it crouched lower, its long arms scraping the floor. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, and I flinched, my grip on the kid tightening. "You can't leave until they decide you're ready," the kid said, their voice hollow. "And they never think anyone's ready." "Not an option," I muttered, dragging the kid toward the kitchen. I figured if the front door wouldn't open, maybe there was another way out, a back door, a window, something, anything. The kitchen was worse. The shadows were thicker here, coiling around the counters and appliances, making the air feel like syrup. The fridge door was wide open, but instead of food, it was filled with more of that dark, rippling void, like the shadows had bled inside. The sink dripped steadily, each drop echoing far louder than it should have. At the far end of the room, there was a glass door leading to the backyard. My heart leapt. I could see the faint outline of the yard outside, blurry but real. I shoved a chair out of the way, dragging the kid with me, and tried the handle. It wouldn't move. "No!" I hissed, yanking at the door with all my strength. "No! No! No!" Behind me, the figure let out a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't quite a growl, but it was close, like a warning. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body was frozen with the kind of fear that goes bone deep, the kind you can't reason your way out of. The kids spoke again, their voice flat and detached. "They don't like it when you try to force things." "Then what do they like?" I snapped, my voice cracking. Because I'm not staying in this house. They like when you listen, the kid said, when you go back upstairs. I stared at them, my chest heaving. You've got to be kidding me. The kid just shrugged, as if what they'd said was the most reasonable thing in the world. That's where it always ends, upstairs. The figure shifted again, its long, jagged limbs dragging across the floor as it moved closer. The air around it seemed to warp, the room bending inward like the house was collapsing around us. My fight or flight instincts were screaming at me, but no matter how much I wanted to run, there was nowhere to go. "Fine," I said, my voice barely audible. "Fine, we'll go back." The figure stopped moving, its head tilting slightly, almost like it was satisfied. The shadows in the kitchen began to retreat, slinking back into the walls and corners as if they were giving me space. I didn't know if I was making the right choice, but I didn't have another one. Gripping the kid's hand tightly, I led them back toward the stairs, my legs trembling with every step. As we climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, waiting to see what I would do next. Each step up the stairs felt heavier, like the house itself was trying to drag me back down. The air was suffocating now, dense and cold, and the shadows seemed to pulse faintly like a heartbeat. The kids stayed close to me, their expression blank, as if they already knew what was waiting for us. When we reached the top, the hallway stretched on endlessly. It wasn't like before. This wasn't the same upstairs I had seen earlier. The doors were gone, replaced by smooth, seamless walls that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. At the far end of the hall was a single door, its frame jagged and uneven, like it had been forced into the wall. "That's the room," the kid said quietly, their voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't want to ask, but the words spilled out anyway. "What's in there?" They didn't answer. Instead, they let go of my hand and walked toward the door, their steps slow and deliberate. I wanted to stop them, to grab them and turn back, but my feet wouldn't move. Something about that door held me in place, like I was rooted to the spot. The kid reached the door and turned the knob. It didn't creak or groan like I expected. It opened silently, revealing a pitch-black void beyond. I couldn't see a single thing inside, but I could feel it. The same presence that had been in the shadows, in the walls, in every inch of the house. It was waiting for me. The kid turned to look at me, their face illuminated by the faint, flickering light from the hallway. For the first time, I saw something like fear in their eyes. "You have to go in," they said. "It's the only way it ends." My chest tightened. "I'm not leaving you here," I said, my voice shaking. "You can't take me," the kid replied. "I've always been here, but you can still leave. If they let you." The words didn't make sense, but I couldn't argue. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the hallway toward the door. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until every breath felt like shards of glass scraping my lungs. When I reached the threshold, I hesitated. The darkness inside wasn't just the absence of light. It was deeper, more complete, like it swallowed anything that came near it. I glanced back at the kid, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but they just stood there, watching silently. "Go," they said, their voice firm now, "before it changes its mind." Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the darkness. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed in the void, sharp and final, and I was left standing in complete, oppressive silence. The air here felt different, thicker, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I held out my hands, but there was nothing to touch. No walls, no floor, no sense of direction, just endless blackness. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and I realized I wasn't alone. It was here. The presence I'd felt throughout the house, the thing that had been watching me from the shadows, was all around me now. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, like a cold, suffocating weight pressing against my skin. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For a long moment there was no response. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice spoke. It wasn't the guttural sound I'd heard before. It was softer, almost human, but layered with something that made my skin crawl. "Stay." The word sent a jolt of fear through me. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't. I need to leave." The presence shifted, and I felt something brush against my arm. It wasn't solid, more like a wisp of cold air, but it was enough to make me recoil. "Leave then," the voice said, "but you'll take us with you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I didn't understand what it meant, but I didn't have time to think. The blackness began to recede, and suddenly I was standing in the hallway again, the door to the room gone as if it had never existed. The kid was gone too. The house was quiet now, the air still. I didn't wait to question what had happened. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, and into the night, not stopping until I was back in my car. It's been a week since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. My apartment feels different now, colder, quieter, like it's waiting. I see shadows where there shouldn't be any, and sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers that sound like the kid's voice. I don't know what I brought back with me, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never take another babysitting job again. I found a dark web service that sells future predictions. Mine ends in 2 days. So I guess I should start by saying I never believed in any of this stuff. The dark web, predictions, spooky nonsense. None of it. I knew the dark web was real, but to me it was just a place for overhyped urban legends. Stories about hitmen for hire or cursed items or people selling haunted dolls. I figured most of it was either scams or just exaggerated horror for clicks. That changed. 2 weeks ago, it started when I was up late, doom scrolling through Reddit. I'd stumbled on a thread in a tech forum where people were discussing weird, deep web services. It was mostly jokes, stuff like, "Oh yeah, I paid 2 Bitcoin for an immortal pet snail." But one comment stood out. It said, "Ever heard of the Oracle site? It's not a scam, it's real, and it's terrifying." It had 0 upvotes, no replies, just sitting there, buried in the thread. Naturally, I was curious. I mean, if it was a joke, it wasn't even a funny one. If it was real, well, I wanted to know. So I clicked on the user's profile, but it was blank. No posts, no comments, nothing. The account had been deleted. Weird, right? But the name stuck with me. Oracle. I ended up Googling it later that night, not expecting much. Instead, I found a cryptic forum post with instructions on how to access the site. It wasn't your typical click this link situation. There was a whole setup process with Tor, VPNs, and some code you had to paste into a browser. The more I read, the more it felt like a challenge, like some puzzle meant to weed out casuals. I'm not proud of it, but curiosity got the best of me. I spent the next 2 hours setting everything up, and eventually I found it. The site was bare bones, just a black screen with a single line of text in white. "Welcome to the Oracle, enter your question." That's it. No flashy design, no explanation, just a blinking cursor underneath the text. For a second, I thought I'd wasted my time on a glorified chatbot, but I was already here, so I figured, why not? I typed in the first dumb question that came to mind. Will I ever be rich? The response was instant. The screen flickered, and new text appeared. Irrelevant. Okay, rude. I rolled my eyes and decided to play along. I typed something else. What's the purpose of this site? This time, the screen flickered longer before the text appeared. To reveal truths you are not prepared to know. Now I was intrigued. I leaned in closer, typing my next question with a little more thought. What's going to happen to me? The screen went black for a moment. Then, slowly, words appeared. Your life will end in 14 days. I froze. My first reaction was to laugh it off. Obviously this was a prank, right? Some edgy programmer messing with people for kicks. But the delivery, it felt so specific. Too calculated, like the site knew something I didn't. Still, I wasn't about to let some creepy website freak me out. I shut my laptop and went to bed, convincing myself it was all just a dumb joke. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. I went to work, ran errands, did everything I could to distract myself. But no matter how hard I tried, those words kept creeping back into my head. Your life will end in 14 days. It wasn't just what it said, it was how it felt. Like it wasn't just predicting my future, it was promising it. By the time I got home that night, I couldn't resist. I opened my laptop and went back to the site. I told myself I'd prove it was fake by asking something impossible. Something no random program could know. I typed, "What did I eat for dinner last night?" The response came quickly this time, and when I saw the words, my blood ran cold. Chicken stir-fry. I hadn't told anyone what I ate, no photos, no texts, nothing. And yet, there it was, perfectly accurate. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, shaking. The next few days were a blur. I kept going back to the site, asking question after question. Every time, the answers were right. It knew where I'd been that day, what I'd said to my co-workers, even things I hadn't told anyone in years. It was like the site had access to my entire life, past and present. And the countdown, it was still there, shrinking with every visit. 12 days. 11 days. By the time it hit 10 days, I stopped asking questions. I didn't want to know anymore, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if it wasn't just some elaborate hoax? What if the prediction was real? Then strange things started happening. I noticed a car parked outside my apartment, the same one every night. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe a neighbor or someone visiting, but the car never left. And when I walked past it one night, I could feel someone watching me through the tinted windows. My phone started glitching too. Random notifications would pop up, saying things like, "You have 8 days left," or "Are you ready?" I tried to screenshot them, but the images wouldn't save. It felt like the site was bleeding into my life, like I couldn't escape it no matter what I did. The worst part? The dreams. Every night, I'd see myself standing in a dark room, surrounded by shadows. The whispers would start low, then grow louder until they became deafening. And then right before I woke up, I'd see it. A figure standing at the edge of the room, watching me with empty eyes. And it always said the same thing. "Time's running out." By the time the countdown hit 2 days, I knew I had to do something. I didn't know what, but I couldn't just sit around waiting for whatever was coming. The site wasn't just predicting my future, it was controlling it, and I had to figure out how to stop it. By the time the countdown hit 2 days, everything felt wrong. I wasn't eating, barely sleeping, and the world around me had taken on this sharp, hostile edge. It was like every shadow was a little too dark, every creak in my apartment a little too loud. The car was still there, parked in the same spot every night. I tried to get a good look at it during the day, but the windows were tinted black, and there were no license plates. I thought about calling the cops, but what was I supposed to say? "Hi, I'm being stalked by a car." That night, I decided to confront it. I grabbed my phone, walked outside, and approached the car as casually as I could. The closer I got, the more my heart pounded, like my body was begging me to turn around. But I forced myself forward until I was close enough to touch it. I knocked on the driver's side window. No response. I knocked again, harder this time. "Hey, I see you! What do you want?" The window didn't roll down. The door didn't open, but I swear I could feel someone inside, watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and this wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to take a step back. Then the car's engine roared to life. I stumbled away, my phone fumbling out of my hand, as the car peeled out of its spot and sped down the street. I didn't even bother picking up my phone. I just ran back inside, locking every door and window behind me. When I finally worked up the nerve to go outside and grab my phone, I found something else lying next to it. A small, folded piece of paper. I took the paper inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unfold it. The handwriting was neat and precise, almost mechanical, and the message was short. "You shouldn't have asked." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Someone or something had been watching me, following me. It wasn't just the car. I started noticing other things too. Strangers on the street lingering just a little too long. Unfamiliar faces in places they shouldn't be. I'd catch someone staring at me in the grocery store, and the moment I looked back, they'd disappear into the aisles. It felt like the whole world was in on some joke I didn't understand. I tried to distract myself, but it didn't work. My phone was glitching worse than ever now. Random notifications would pop up, and the messages were getting more aggressive. "Time's almost up." "You can't run." I even tried turning it off, but somehow it kept buzzing, the screen lighting up with messages I couldn't escape. And then the dreams got worse. That night I woke up at exactly 3:03 a.m. It wasn't because of a nightmare this time, at least not one I could remember. Something had woken me up. There was a sound, a faint tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the sound came again. It was coming from the window, the one directly across from my bed. My blinds were closed, but I could see the faint outline of a shadow standing just outside. Not moving, just standing there, watching. My brain screamed at me not to look, but I couldn't help it. I reached out, slowly pulling the string to lift the blinds. The tapping stopped. The window was empty, but just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, more out of instinct than anything else, and saw a single new message. "We're closer than you think." By the time the sun came up, I'd convinced myself it was all in my head. Sleep deprivation does weird things to you, right? Maybe the tapping was just a branch outside, and the shadow was my imagination. I didn't want to think about the message. But when I went to leave for work, I found something that made me question everything all over again. There were footprints outside my window. Clear, unmistakable footprints in the dirt, leading away from the glass and disappearing into the street. Whoever, or whatever, had been there wasn't a figment of my imagination. I decided to stay home from work that day. I told my boss I was sick, but the truth was, I didn't feel safe leaving the apartment. I spent most of the morning pacing around, double-checking the locks, trying to come up with some kind of plan. Around noon, my laptop buzzed. Not my phone, my laptop. I didn't even know it could buzz, but when I opened it, the screen was already on, displaying a single line of text. "Log back in." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't want to. Every instinct I had was telling me to close the laptop and throw it out the window. But I couldn't. The urge to know was stronger than the fear. I opened Tor, went through the motions, and found myself staring at the Oracle's black screen again. The countdown was still there, glaring back at me. One day, I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, I typed, "What's going to happen to me tomorrow?" The screen flickered. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the words appeared. "You'll understand." I slammed the laptop shut and threw it across the room. The screen cracked on impact, but I didn't care. I wanted it gone, out of my sight. But even with it broken, I could still feel it. The knowledge, the countdown, the inevitability of whatever was coming. Tomorrow. Something was coming tomorrow, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I didn't leave the apartment, not for food, not for water, nothing. I locked myself in with every light on, sitting in the middle of my living room like that would somehow protect me. The air felt heavy, like the apartment was pressing down on me. Every creak in the walls, every passing car outside felt magnified, like it wasn't just noise, but some kind of signal. By the time it got dark, I realized something even worse. The power was flickering. It didn't make sense. The weather was fine, no storms, no outages reported. But the lights would dim for just a second, enough to make the shadows stretch in ways they shouldn't. The whole room felt alive, like it was watching me, and the whispers had started again. Not loud, just faint murmurs, like voices coming through the walls. Sometimes they said my name, drawn out and slow, like they were testing how it sounded. Other times, they weren't even words, just a low hum that sent chills up my spine. I couldn't tell if it was inside my head or the building itself. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The screen lit up with a new message. It's almost time. I threw the phone across the room, but it didn't matter. The buzzing started again, louder this time, like the phone was vibrating from the inside out. I covered my ears, but the sound was everywhere now, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from every corner of the apartment. And then it stopped. The silence was worse. I spent the next few hours pacing, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe this was all just some elaborate prank, some hacker messing with me, planting messages on my devices and sending people to freak me out. It was a desperate thought, but I clung to it. And then the knocking started. It was faint at first, like someone lightly tapping on the door. But it wasn't coming from the front door, it was coming from inside the apartment, from the closet in my bedroom. My stomach dropped. I hadn't opened that closet in weeks. It was where I threw all the junk I didn't want to deal with, old clothes, broken appliances, boxes of random stuff. Nobody could be in there, it wasn't possible. But the knocking kept going, slow and deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side, wanted me to know it was there. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy metal lamp, and crept toward the bedroom. The air grew colder with every step, like I was walking into a freezer. The door was cracked open just enough to see the edge of the closet. The knocking stopped. For a moment I just stood there, frozen, staring at the closet door. My breath was shallow, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. I had to know. I reached out and yanked the closet door open. It was empty, no boxes, no clothes, nothing. The space inside was dark, impossibly dark, like it went deeper than it should. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and then I saw it. The mark. It was burned into the back wall of the closet, the same symbol I'd seen on the Oracle site. The lines glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the hum that was now vibrating through the apartment. I slammed the closet door shut and stumbled back into the living room. The power cut out completely around 3 a.m. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything in the room. I scrambled to find my phone, using its weak glow to navigate, but the battery was draining faster than it should. The whispers returned, louder now, circling me, overlapping until they became one voice. You asked. The voice was deep, guttural, almost mechanical. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through my chest. I turned in circles, trying to find the source, but the room was empty. You wanted to know. Who's there? My voice came out as a whisper, trembling. What do you want from me? The shadows seemed to ripple, stretching toward me. The mark on my arm burned, the pain sharp and searing, like a brand being pressed into my skin. It's time! The front door slammed open, and the cold rushed in, biting at my skin. I backed away, clutching my phone like it was some kind of lifeline, but the screen flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. Something stepped inside. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The weight of its presence, the way the air seemed to shift around it. It moved closer, slow and deliberate, each step sending vibrations through the floor. You can't run. My back hit the wall and I realized there was nowhere left to go. The figure was right in front of me now, its outline barely visible in the darkness. It wasn't human, that much was clear. Its form shifted, rippling like smoke, and its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of light in the void. You wanted to know the truth. The room began to spin, the whispers growing louder until they were deafening. The mark on my arm burned brighter, the lines glowing the same faint light as the figure's eyes. And then everything stopped. The whispers, the humming, the cold. It all vanished, replaced by a suffocating silence. The figure leaned in closer, its glowing eyes inches from mine. Tomorrow you'll understand. I woke up on the floor the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows. The apartment was silent, the power back on, and everything looked normal. But I knew better. The countdown was over, and tonight I'd find out what was waiting for me. The sun was up, but it didn't feel like morning. The air was heavy, thicker than it should have been, and my apartment felt smaller somehow, claustrophobic. Even with all the lights on, there was this lingering shadow in every corner, like the darkness didn't want to leave. I didn't go to work. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't even eat. All I could do was sit there, watching the clock tick down, knowing it was only a matter of time. By noon, I started hearing the whispers again. They weren't as loud as before, more like a faint hum that came and went, almost like breathing. I walked through every room in the apartment, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then, at exactly 3:33 p.m., the first crack appeared. It was in the middle of my living room wall, small and jagged, like something had pushed through from the other side. I stood there, staring at it, hoping it was just my imagination, but it wasn't. The crack spread slowly, spidering out across the wall like veins. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? Hey, my wall's cracking because some dark web oracle told me I'd die today. Yeah, that would go over well. I grabbed my phone anyway, but the screen was completely blank. Not frozen, just empty. No apps, no text, nothing. It was like it had been wiped clean. I threw it onto the couch and turned back to the wall, but the crack was gone. In its place was the mark, burned into the wall, the same glowing symbol that had been haunting me for days. The lines pulsed faintly and the room grew colder. I backed away, my breath visible in the freezing air, and that's when I saw the shadow. It was faint at first, barely more than a smudge in the corner of my vision. But as I turned toward it, it grew darker, deeper, until it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching, It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting like smoke. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and piercing, like it was looking straight through me. "Time's up." The voice was low and guttural, vibrating through the air. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the figure or from inside my own head. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I managed to take a step back. "What do you want from me?" My voice barely came out as a whisper. The figure tilted its head, its form rippling like a mirage. "You asked for the truth." I didn't understand. The truth about what? About my future? About the stupid countdown? None of it made any sense. But before I could say anything, the figure took a step forward. The room shifted around it, the walls bending and warping like they were made of liquid. The mark on the wall pulsed brighter, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Stop!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the noise. The figure raised a hand, if you could even call it that, and the room went completely dark. When the lights came back on, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was standing in the middle of a massive, empty space. The floor was smooth and black, reflecting the faint glow of countless symbols etched into the walls. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the symbols, like they were alive. The figure was still there, standing a few feet away. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just pointed at something behind me. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There was a door. It was massive, carved from the same black material as the floor, and covered in symbols that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. The handle was a circular indentation, the same size and shape as the mark on my arm. "This is what you wanted," the figure said. Its voice was quieter now, almost calm. "The answer lies beyond." I shook my head, backing away. "Number, I didn't ask for this. I didn't—" "You did," it interrupted, stepping closer. "You asked what your future would be. This is it." I didn't have a choice. The mark on my arm burned hotter, brighter, pulling me toward the door like a magnet. My hand moved on its own, pressing into the indentation. The symbols on the door flared to life, and it began to open. The light from beyond was blinding, but I could see shapes moving within it, shadows twisting and writhing, their forms impossible to define. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand, and the figure stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "You'll understand soon." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run, but where would I go? The door was open now, the light pouring out, and there was no escaping it. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing on the threshold. And then I stepped through. The last thing I remember is the light swallowing me whole, the whispers fading into silence. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The cracks in the wall were gone. The mark on my arm had disappeared. But something was different. The air felt heavier, thicker, and the world outside the windows looked off. The colours were muted, the shadows longer, like everything was slightly out of sync. And when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, it wasn't me. It smiled. And then it whispered, "Your turn." At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A smudge on the mirror, maybe. But as I stepped closer, I realized the face staring back at me wasn't mine. It had my features, the same eyes, the same mouth, but the expression was wrong. Too sharp, too knowing, like it was wearing my face, and it was still smiling. I froze, staring at the reflection as my chest tightened. My lips weren't moving, but the reflections were. Slowly, deliberately, it whispered, "Your turn." I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the lamp behind me. When I looked again, the mirror was empty. My reflection was gone. Just a blank sheet of glass, reflecting nothing but the dim light of my apartment. I should have run. I should have packed a bag, smashed my phone, and disappeared. But it was like my body wouldn't let me. Something deeper, stronger, was keeping me rooted there. The apartment felt alive now, every shadow watching, every creak whispering my name. Then the knock came. It was soft at first, almost polite. Just a single tap on the front door. I froze, my mind racing. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely audible. No answer. I crept toward the door, my heart pounding, and peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was dark, darker than it should have been. The overhead light was out, and the shadows seemed thicker, heavier, like they were pressing against the door. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hall, shrouded in darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out its face, if it even had one, but I felt its gaze, cold and unrelenting. And then it raised a hand and pointed at the door. I backed away, grabbing my phone from the couch. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single message. "You have 24 hours. The countdown had restarted. I didn't understand. The oracle had said I'd die. The countdown had reached 0, but here I was, alive, breathing, and somehow still trapped in whatever nightmare this was. I spent the rest of the night trying to figure it out. I searched every corner of the apartment looking for answers, but all I found were more questions. The mark was gone from my arm, but I could still feel it, a faint, burning sensation just beneath the skin. The whispers were quieter now, almost like they were waiting. And then, just before dawn, I heard it, a faint, clicking sound like nails tapping against glass. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting in knots. The sound was coming from the window again, but this time, when I pulled the blinds back, it wasn't empty. There was something on the other side. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could describe. Its form shifted constantly, like smoke trapped in a glass box, twisting and writhing against the edges of reality. 2 glowing eyes stared back at me, unblinking, filled with something that wasn't curiosity or malice. It was worse. It was hunger. The tapping stopped, and the thing pressed closer to the glass, its face, or what passed for one, tilting as if to get a better look at me. Then, without warning, the glass began to crack. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table as the cracks spread like spiderwebs. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic, filling the room with a suffocating noise. The glass didn't shatter, though. It melted, flowing like liquid as the thing began to push through. That's when the door slammed open. The figure from the hallway stepped inside. It didn't even bother closing the door behind it, just stood there, watching, as the thing from the window poured into the room like smoke. The 2 of them didn't acknowledge each other, like they weren't separate beings at all. Just different pieces of the same whole. The figure raised a hand and the whispers stopped. The thing from the window froze mid-movement, its form suspended in the air like it was waiting for permission to continue. "You opened the door," the figure said. Its voice was calm, almost soothing. "And now you must carry it." "I don't understand," I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, just like the reflection had. "You asked for the truth. Now you will deliver it." Before I could respond, the thing from the window surged forward, engulfing me. It wasn't solid, it was cold and weightless, like stepping into freezing fog. My vision blurred, and for a moment everything went silent. And then I saw it. It wasn't my life flashing before my eyes, it was something else, a vast endless void filled with symbols and whispers and shadows. Faces I didn't recognize stared back at me, their mouths moving silently. I saw 1,000 doorways, all leading to the same endless darkness. And in the center of it all was the oracle. Not the website, but the thing behind it. A pulsing mass of light and shadow, ancient and incomprehensible. It wasn't a machine, or a program, or even a being. It was something more, something that shouldn't exist. Its voice echoed in my mind. You are the vessel now. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The door was closed, the window unbroken. Everything looked normal. Too normal, but I wasn't alone. The figure was standing in the corner of the room, silent and still. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. And on my phone, the countdown had restarted. 24 hours. I realized then that it wasn't counting down to my death. It was counting down to the next person, the next question, the next truth. And I was the one who had to deliver it. The whispers are louder now, and the mark is back, burning hotter than ever. The countdown is ticking away, and I know I can't stop it. The oracle isn't done. It never will be. Because now, I'm part of it. I bought a flashlight from the dark web that claims to reveal the truth. When I shine it, I see people who aren't there. I don't really know why I started browsing the dark web. I guess I was bored. You know how it is, late at night, nothing on TV, and you've already scrolled through TikTok for hours. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just poking around. Most of it was the kind of sketchy stuff you'd expect. Fake passports, sketchier pharmaceuticals, even a guy offering hired revenge. It's all weird and a little disturbing, but it doesn't feel real, like some twisted online flea market. Then I found it. The listing was buried on one of those curiosity marketplaces. You know, the ones selling supposed cursed objects and weird relics that claim to be from ancient rituals. The title read, "Truth Light, See What's Hidden in the Shadows." The description wasn't long, just a bunch of vague claims about the flashlight revealing what your eyes are too weak to see. It was dumb, but something about it caught my attention. The product photo showed a plain black flashlight, nothing special. It wasn't even expensive, just $50, which for the dark web is practically a steal. The seller's page had a bunch of positive reviews too, stuff like "changed my life" and "you can't unsee what's revealed, but it's worth knowing." I clicked "buy now." The package arrived faster than I expected, just 3 days later, no return address, no instructions. The flashlight came wrapped in brown paper with a note tucked inside. It looked like it had been torn out of a notebook, the handwriting shaky and uneven. All it said was, "Be careful where you point it, some truths don't want to be seen." Now, I'll be honest, I should have stopped there. But curiosity got the better of me. I mean, it's a flashlight. How dangerous could it be? That night, I waited until it was dark, turned off all the lights in my apartment, and gave it a try. At first, nothing seemed weird. I shone it around the room, half expecting some cheap glow-in-the-dark effect or hidden ink writing, but nope, just a regular flashlight beam. I checked the note again, wondering if I'd missed something, and that's when I noticed it. In the corner of my living room, near the bookshelf, the beam caught something. Off. It was faint, barely noticeable, but when I focused the light, it became clearer. A shape standing just outside the edge of the beam. It looked like a person, but not quite. Their outline was blurry, like they were made of static, and they didn't move. I froze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. The figure stayed perfectly still. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to step closer. As I did, the shape seemed to shift, flickering in and out like a bad TV signal, and then just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I turned the flashlight off, my hands trembling. For a moment, the room was completely silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe some weird reflection, but deep down I didn't believe that. I should have put the flashlight away right then, maybe even thrown it out, but instead I kept going. I moved to the kitchen, shining the beam across the counters, the sink, the floor. Nothing. I was starting to feel a little silly, like I'd scared myself over nothing. But then, as the beam passed over the window, I saw it again. Another figure. This one was clearer, more solid. A woman standing just outside the window, staring straight at me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, I can't even describe them. They weren't angry or sad or anything normal. They just looked hollow. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping out of my hand and clattering to the floor. When I looked back at the window, she was gone. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the apartment made me jump. Every shadow looked like it was moving. I left the flashlight on the kitchen counter and tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the image of that woman's face was burned into my mind. The next morning, I decided to test the flashlight in daylight. Maybe it would act normal, and I could chalk the whole thing up to my imagination. I shone it around the apartment, moving from room to room. Nothing unusual. I even checked the bookshelf and the window, but there was no sign of the figures. For a while, I felt relieved. Maybe I was just tired, and my brain had been playing tricks on me. But as I was about to put the flashlight away, I noticed something new. There was a mark on my bedroom wall. It wasn't there the day before, I was sure of it. It looked like a handprint, dark and smudged, like someone had pressed their palm against the wall with dirty fingers. I touched it, expecting paint or soot, but the wall was clean. The handprint wasn't physical, it only showed up when the flashlight's beam hit it. My stomach churned as I followed the handprint, moving the beam slowly along the wall. It led to the closet. The door was slightly ajar. I don't know why I didn't stop. Every instinct told me to turn around, to get out of the apartment, but I couldn't. I pushed the closet door open with the beam of light, revealing nothing but clothes and boxes. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then, from the shadows, a face appeared. It was different from the others, sharper and more defined. The features were twisted, almost animalistic, with sunken eyes and a mouth that stretched into a jagged grin. It wasn't moving, but I swear it was looking at me. The flashlight flickered. For a split second, the entire closet was illuminated, and I saw more of them. Dozens of faces, all staring, all grinning, packed into the tiny space like they were waiting. I dropped the flashlight and slammed the closet door shut, my chest heaving. When I picked the flashlight up again, the beam was steady and the faces were gone. I don't know what I bought. I don't know what I've let into my apartment. But one thing's for sure, the flashlight doesn't just reveal the truth, it shows things that aren't supposed to be seen. And now I can't unsee them. I didn't touch the flashlight again for days. It sat on my kitchen counter like a bad omen, its plain, unassuming design mocking me. I wanted to get rid of it, toss it in the trash or bury it somewhere. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Some part of me needed to understand what I'd seen. Or maybe I was just scared that throwing it away wouldn't make the faces go away. Things didn't go back to normal. My apartment felt different. The air seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I'd hear faint creaks in the walls even when I wasn't moving. At night, I'd wake up suddenly, convinced someone was standing at the foot of my bed, only to find the room empty. Or at least, I thought it was empty. The worst part was the mirrors. I don't know when it started, but every time I passed one, I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye. Not me moving, something else. It was subtle, just a flicker of a shape behind me, gone as soon as I turned my head. I stopped looking directly at them after a while. But the real breaking point came 3 nights later. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the oppressive quiet. My bedroom door was slightly open, just enough for me to see a sliver of the hallway. I wasn't paying attention to it at first, but then I noticed something. The light in the hallway flickered, just once. I sat up, my heart starting to race. It's an old apartment, I told myself. Old wiring, nothing unusual. But then the flicker came again, and this time I thought I saw movement in the corner of my vision. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The hallway was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched crept over me, stronger than ever. My eyes darted to the kitchen counter, where the flashlight from the dark web still sat. I don't know why I reached for it. Every rational part of me screamed not to, but it was like my hand moved on its own. I flicked it on, shining the beam into the hallway. At first, it looked normal. Just the same old beige walls and worn carpet. But as the light moved, the beam caught something at the end of the hall, another handprint smeared on the wall. This one was darker than the first, almost black, and it dripped as if the print had just been made. My throat tightened. I shone the flashlight back toward my bedroom, and that's when I saw her. The woman from the window. She was standing just inside my bedroom, near the foot of my bed. Her face was as hollow and pale as before, her dark eyes fixed on me. But now I could see more of her. Her limbs were too long, her fingers stretched unnaturally, almost brushing the floor. She didn't move, she just stood there, staring. I backed away, nearly tripping over myself, but I kept the light on her. The beam flickered, and for a split second she was gone. Then, as the light steadied, she was closer. I froze. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short gasps. My hand shook as I kept the flashlight trained on her. She was still staring, her head tilting slightly, her hollow eyes narrowing. And then she smiled. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, the skin pulling taut over her cheeks. It wasn't a human smile, it was something wrong, something that didn't belong. She took one step forward, her movements slow and jerky, like a puppet on strings. I don't remember making the decision to move. 1 second I was frozen, the next I was bolting for the door. I ran out of the apartment, the flashlight still clutched in my hand, and didn't stop until I was halfway down the street. When I finally slowed, I realized I had no idea where I was going. It was almost midnight, and the streets were empty, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, and that's when I felt it, the same oppressive feeling I'd had in the apartment. Someone was watching me. I turned around, shining the flashlight into the shadows. At first, I saw nothing, just empty sidewalks and darkened windows. But then the beam caught something far off in the distance, a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. It wasn't the woman this time, it was something else. Its shape was wrong, its limbs too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, even from that distance. The flashlight flickered, and when the beam steadied, the figure was closer. I ran. I don't know how far I went or how long I ran. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. Finally, I ducked into an all-night convenience store, collapsing against the shelves near the back. The fluorescent lights felt harsh, but comforting, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness outside. The cashier gave me a weird look, but didn't say anything. I stayed there for hours, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, waiting for the first hint of daylight. When the sun finally rose, I went back to my apartment. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would feel safer in the light, but as soon as I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavier than ever, and the mirrors, all of them were shattered. Every reflective surface in the apartment was cracked, shards of glass littering the floor. And scrawled on the largest shard of glass, written in dark, dripping letters, was a single word. See. I stared at the word on the broken mirror. See. Until my vision blurred. It felt like the glass was mocking me, daring me to pick up the flashlight again. My stomach twisted, and I fought the urge to throw the thing across the room. Instead, I placed it on the table, as far away from me as possible, and sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Could this be some kind of stress-induced hallucination? But then my eyes wandered to the mirror shards scattered on the floor, each one reflecting fragments of the room. They weren't showing the same thing. The largest shard reflected the empty couch across from me, but one of the smaller ones showed a dark figure standing just behind it. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure wasn't moving, but its silhouette was unmistakable, tall, thin, and crooked, with limbs that seemed stretched too far. I turned to look at the couch directly. Nothing. Just an empty, worn piece of furniture. But when I glanced back at the shard, the figure was closer, leaning over the back of the couch like it was peering into the room. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight off the table, pointed it at the mirror shard, and flicked it on. The beam didn't just illuminate the shard, it changed it. The reflection rippled like water, distorting the image, and the figure disappeared. I let out a shaky breath, but my relief was short-lived. A whisper, faint but distinct, echoed through the room. "Keep looking." I spun around, the flashlight's beam slicing through the shadows. The room was empty, but the whisper came again, louder this time. "Keep looking." My hands shook as I shone the flashlight toward the broken mirror again. This time, the light caught something new, more handprints smeared across the walls. They led out of the living room and into the hallway like a trail inviting me to follow. I didn't want to follow. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the apartment, to get out while I still could. But my legs moved on their own, like I was being pulled by some invisible force. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the handprints multiplying with every step I took. They glistened in the flashlight's beam, dripping like fresh ink. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that spoke in words I couldn't understand. It sounded like they were coming from the end of the hall. When I reached my bedroom, the door was open wide. I didn't remember leaving it that way. Inside, the air was cold, colder than it had any right to be. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight around the room. The beam caught movement. Something was crouched in the far corner, hunched and twisted. Its back was to me, and its limbs twitched unnaturally, like it was struggling to stay still. My chest tightened as I took a step closer, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out. My voice sounded small, hollow. The thing didn't answer. Instead, it turned its head, slowly, unnaturally, like it had to force its neck to bend. When its face came into view, I felt the blood drain from my body. It wasn't a face, it was a void, a hollow darkness where features should have been. But even without eyes, I could feel it looking at me, its attention pressing against my skin like a physical weight. The flashlight flickered. In that split second of darkness, the thing was gone. When the beam steadied, the corner was empty, but the whispering had become a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the walls. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the flashlight. The hum didn't stop. It followed me into the hallway, growing louder, more insistent. It felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows creeping closer. I stumbled back into the living room, gasping for air. The mirrors were still broken, the shards scattered across the floor. And then I saw it, my own reflection, staring back at me from one of the shards. But it wasn't me. The reflection's eyes were wide and hollow, its mouth twisted into the same unnatural grin I'd seen before. It raised a hand, waving slowly, even though I wasn't moving. "Stop," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Just stop." The reflection's grin widened, its head tilting unnaturally. Then in one smooth motion it pressed its hand against the glass. A crack split through the shard. I dropped the flashlight and stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispering stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then my phone buzzed. I didn't want to look. I knew nothing good could come from it, but my hand moved on its own, pulling the phone from my pocket. The screen lit up with a new message. No number, just blank. The message read, "You're almost ready to see." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. The words still burned into my mind. I didn't know what I was supposed to see, but I had a sinking feeling I wouldn't like the answer. After that message, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear faint whispers, feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me. The apartment was suffocating, every corner brimming with shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I spent hours pacing the living room, my phone in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I thought about leaving, grabbing my keys, walking out the door, and never coming back. But some part of me, the part that had bought the flashlight in the first place, couldn't let it go. I needed answers, even if they terrified me. The next night, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the flashlight, trying to convince myself to just turn it on and get it over with. The air was thick, heavy with that same oppressive silence. Then out of nowhere, I heard it, the hum. It started low, almost like a vibration under the floor, but it grew quickly. Within seconds, it was a deafening roar, shaking the walls, rattling the pictures on the shelves. The lights flickered, dimming until the room was bathed in shadows. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body tense, my ears strained for any sound, any clue about what was coming next. And then, from the hallway, I heard the creak of a floorboard. Someone or something was there. I raised the flashlight, my finger hovering over the switch. The beam felt like my only weapon, my only shield against whatever was creeping closer. My throat was dry, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the sound of the footsteps. Another creak, closer this time. "Who's there?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. No response, just the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps inching down the hallway toward me. I couldn't wait any longer. I flicked the flashlight on and aimed it toward the hallway. At first, there was nothing, just the same beige walls and scuffed floorboards. But as I moved the beam down the hall, it caught something at the very edge of the light. A figure, tall and distorted, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It wasn't moving, but the way it stood felt wrong, like it was frozen mid-step. I kept the beam on it, my hand trembling. The figure didn't move, but the longer I looked, the more details came into focus. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, smooth surface. And then it twitched. The movement was slight, just a jerk of its arm, but it sent a wave of cold terror through me. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the figure was closer. "No," I whispered, stepping back. "No, no, no." The beam steadied, and the figure was gone. But the hallway wasn't empty. Dark smudges appeared on the walls, like handprints dragging down toward the floor. The whispers started again, low and overlapping, coming from every direction. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The shadows seemed alive, crawling along the edges of the room, just out of reach. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. And then the beam landed on the mirror. It was still cracked, shards scattered across the floor, but the reflection was wrong. Instead of my living room, the mirror showed a dark, endless void, swirling with faint, ghostly figures. They were moving, writhing as if trapped behind the glass. One by one, their faces turned toward me. I couldn't look away. The figures pressed against the surface of the mirror, their mouths open in silent screams. One of them raised a hand and pointed directly at me. The flashlight flickered again. When the beam steadied, the figures were gone, but the word "see" was etched into the surface of the mirror, deeper and darker than before. I stumbled back, my chest heaving. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my phone and the flashlight, bolting out of the apartment without looking back. The hallway outside felt just as wrong, the lights dim and flickering. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I sat on the curb, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting another cryptic message, but it was just the home screen. No notifications, no missed calls, just normal. But when I looked closer, I realized something was off. The wallpaper on my phone had changed. It was no longer the photo of my dog I'd set years ago. Instead, it was black, with a single word in white letters. Truth. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. I tried changing the wallpaper back, but the phone wouldn't let me. No matter what I did, the word stayed there, staring back at me. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, whatever I'd unleashed, it wasn't going to stop. It wanted me to look, to see. And I was starting to think there was no way out. After the phone incident, I knew running wouldn't help. Wherever I went, it would follow. The flashlight, the whispers, the things. They weren't bound to my apartment or any physical space. They were tied to me now. And the worst part? I had a feeling they'd always been there. I just hadn't been able to see them until now. I didn't go back inside. Instead, I walked aimlessly through the night, the flashlight in my hand, its weight somehow heavier than it should have been. Every corner I turned, every empty street, felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to mess up. By the time I stopped walking, the sun was starting to rise. I'd ended up in a park, one of those small ones tucked between apartment buildings. It was empty, the playground rusted and overgrown, the grass damp with morning dew. I sat on a bench and stared at the flashlight, my mind racing. I had two choices: use it again and face whatever truth it wanted me to see, or get rid of it and spend the rest of my life wondering if it would come back for me. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out my thoughts. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the ground. The beam illuminated a path of footprints, dark and wet, leading away from the bench. They weren't mine. I hadn't moved yet. The prints were larger than any humans, the edges smudged like whatever made them had claws. I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The footprints led to the playground, stopping at the base of the slide. I pointed the flashlight upward, and there, perched at the top, was a figure. It wasn't human. Its body was twisted, hunched, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its skin was pale and mottled, like it had been stretched too tightly over its bones. Its head snapped toward me, and I froze. The face, or what should have been a face, was blank, just like the figure in my apartment. But this one was different. Its blankness wasn't just an absence of features, it was an absence of anything. Looking at it felt like staring into a void, a place where nothing could or should exist. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure moved, climbing down the slide with jerky, insect-like motions. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. Every step it took felt like the ground was shrinking, pulling me closer to it. And then it spoke. You wanted the truth. Its voice was a chorus of tones, deep and guttural, high and screeching, and everything in between. It wasn't coming from the figure itself, but from everywhere around me, vibrating in my skull. "What truth?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The figure stopped, tilting its head. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the beam caught something behind it. More figures, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows. They all looked the same, blank and twisted, their movements synchronized like they were being pulled by the same invisible strings. The first figure raised a hand, pointing at me with long, spindly fingers. "The truth is, in the light." The flashlight flickered again, and this time the beam split. Instead of a single, focused light, it spread out, casting multiple beams in all directions. Everywhere the light touched, the world changed. The trees became skeletal, their branches writhing like they were alive. The ground was no longer grass, but a dark, shifting substance that oozed under my feet. And the figures, they were everywhere, surrounding me, watching, waiting. I fell to my knees, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The whispers turned into screams, voices that tore through my mind, each one shouting a single word I couldn't understand. And then, just as I thought I'd lose myself completely, the light focused again. In the center of the playground, where the figures had been, stood a mirror. It was massive, its surface polished to a shine that seemed to glow in the dim light. I didn't want to approach it, but my legs moved on their own, dragging me forward. When I reached the mirror, I saw myself. But it wasn't me. The reflection stared back with hollow eyes, its face twisted into that same unnatural grin I'd seen in the shards of glass. It raised a hand, mirroring my movements, and then it spoke. "You asked for the truth. Now you are it." The mirror cracked, and the sound was deafening. I fell backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand. The world around me blurred, the figures dissolving into shadows, the whispers fading into silence. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The flashlight was gone. The mirrors were whole again. Everything looked normal, too normal. But the air felt wrong, heavy with something I couldn't name. I stood up, my head spinning, and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. It smiled, and I didn't. I don't know if this is over. I don't know if it ever will be. But one thing is certain. Once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And the truth is always watching.